The voice of sharing. Durian ASEAN.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hey, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today we have a guest. He has been with us for a couple of weeks now. Of course, we have Azrul, Khalib in the house.
Hi, Arlene.
Hey, so today we are going to discuss in conjunction with Malaysia Day, 16 September, this beautiful Tuesday. Why are we talking about the future of Malaysia in the next 50 years?
Well, Arlene, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. And also, just wanted to wish a very quick Happy Malaysia Day to all Malaysians listening out there and also to the rest of ASEAN. We're celebrating 51 years of Malaysia and we just celebrated 57 years of Merdeka.
Independence Day.
Yeah, Independence Day. So why are we discussing about next 50 years?
Yeah, why?
Yeah. Is that, well, for one thing, I think, it's like a midterm review. It's like whenever you do these programs, right, and you say that we are having a 100-year project, which is this country, and we are now at this point where we need a midterm review. We need to take stock of what we've done in the past 50 years in order to move on to the next 50 years.
Before we go analyzing the next 50 years, how we would end up being or what kind of Malaysia that we envision, let's look back 51 years, how we started in 1963 on 16th of September. At that time, Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak and Peninsular Malaysia were formed together to be the Federation of Malaysia.
Yep.
At that time, what were the population of Malaysian, the demographic, the sentiment, the vision?
Well, I could tell you that for one thing, the population was half of what we have today. I think actually less than half. I think it was around 12 million at that point of time. And when Tunku Abdul Rahman read the proclamation of Malaysia, we were at a point where the combined population of Malaysia was around close to 12 million. Today, Malaysia is 30 million. Imagine that, we've progressed so far. We look at
And we make so many babies.
Yeah, we make so many, and apparently it's still not enough. They want us to produce more. I don't know.
Remember Dr. Mahathir's policy of projecting Malaysia into 70 million population?
Yeah.
Where is it now?
Well, I don't know, but obviously, family planning isn't in the works, lah. I know if you want to hit 70 million, but consider what you suggested just now. Look back at where we have been in the past 50 years. In a very short space of time, Malaysia has become from a very much agriculture-based society, which is dependent on the industry of tin, has a very much agrarian industry where people were very much segmented into different industries. People were identified not so much as their ethnicity, but basically what they were basically going to be doing. Like so, a person of Indian ethnic origin would be considered a rubber tapper, or somebody who's Chinese would be business, or somebody who would be doing administration maybe would be Malay, and so forth, to something that we have today.
And the British at the time, were they still in Malaya or Malaysia at the time?
I mean, at that point of time, when Malaysia was proclaimed, they were people of English, British nationality were part of the administration. I mean, the British had already left Malaysia at that point in time. We were already independent, but when you consider that a very large identity of and institutions of this country derived from the British, there were people of British origin in the country. But consider where we have progressed. Today, the economy chugs along, on par with many developed countries in the world where Malaysia is able to compete with other countries like in the region, like Singapore, Thailand, and
Remember, in 1963, it was still a relatively young Malaysia. We haven't experienced any racial riot because it happened in 1969. And Singapore were very much part of Malaysia. As we all know, majority of P. Ramlee movies were made in Singapore. A lot of people do not know that. And society at that time were very much segmented into either you are from the rural area or the urban area.
areas. Yeah.
So what were the lives of society back then, according to what your grandparents and your parents accounted?
Well, one thing that has been said time and time again is that life was less complicated then as it is today. Today it's so complex, apparently. It's not only just about the proliferation of internet or smartphones or using computers, but also life was, as you say, you had rural area and then you had the urban people. But the thing is that the politics also were less polarized and divisive.
What
as
were
they
the
today.
sentiment back then when it comes to politics?
Well, consider the fact that the Federation of Malaysia required for there to be referendums, to be carried out. People had to be consulted. People had to be asked whether or not they would be wanting to join Malaysia. And Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore had decided, the peoples in those states had decided that they would join
So Malaysia, after independence and until 1963, at that time, we are very much a young democracy. We practice certain level of democracy in the sense that we get the population of Sabah, Sarawak to vote whether they want to be part of
They were
Malaya.
consulted, yes. They were consulted.
They were consulted. So what happened between 1963 right until today?
Well,
What has changed?
Well, okay. One thing is, I have to say that unfortunately, one thing that hasn't changed is this perception of there's rural and there's urban. Unfortunately, today, when you look at it, when you talk to people, there still is this belief that people in the rural and living in the countryside are less developed, and those who are in the urban areas are much more
But you know what is
privileged and
more what is more frightening is in the past when you talk about urban area you would instantly talk about Kuala Lumpur, and when it comes to inequality is usually cut across the rest of Malaya and Sabah and Sarawak plus Singapore and the urban areas, which is centered around Pulau Pinang, Kuala Lumpur and also Singapore. But nowadays, when you talk about inequality, it exists in every state. The best example is in Sabah and Sarawak. I remember speaking to one of the Sabahan economists. They said that in Sabah, for instance, the inequality is so high that you can see very rich people and very poor people living side by side. For example, you can see a 5-star resort building on an island next to another island where people are living in shambles, and you can see like human waste floating on the sea. That's how.
Well, you can see that off Port Dickson too.
So that is the current situation right now in Malaysia, high inequality. And what about in terms of race relations?
Well, before we go to race relations, let me just address the point concerning income disparity. Income disparity, at the end of the day, when you consider the fact that we've just announced that the household income survey has indicated that Malaysians per household make 5,900 ringgit per household per month, it's quite remarkable. Because when you also consider the fact that the government itself indicated that the Bantuan Rakyat Satu Malaysia, or it's called BRIM, where it was found that 80% of households in the country actually qualify for BRIM. And in order
so it
for
contradicts.
It contradicts because you have
to the earlier statement.
Yeah, because you have to earn less than 3,000 in order to qualify for BRIM. So basically, if 80% of households are making less than 3,000, and then this household income survey say it's 5,900. What you're actually describing, what this survey actually describes, is exactly that income disparity that we were mentioning earlier. So, if you're asking what has happened over the past 50 years or so, what you can actually say when it comes to income disparity is actually the gap has widened considerably. I think the poorer are getting poorer today, especially if you're living in the urban areas, and those who are richer, they're getting a lot more richer. And the distribution of wealth, if we talked about the wealth distribution was being unequal and the cause of ethnic tensions and race riots back in '69, I think today it's a lot more, the gap has increased a lot more considerably compared to what it was in '69.
In 1969, when you talk about the gap between the poor and the rich, you would instantly associate it with race, because at that time it was quite common to see, for example, the Chinese would be situated in the urban area and have more purchasing power and more wealth to live with, while the poor mainly are those who are living in rubber estate and also paddy around the paddy field area, where majority were peasants.
Yep.
And majority of them, unfortunately, are also coming from a certain racial community like the Malays and Indian. So when you talk about racial tension, it is there because race are divided into different segment of professions, which contributes to the high inequality.
Yeah.
But in today's society, if you look at the Forbes billionaire list, you would see Chinese, Malay, Indian in the list. And if you talk about the people in power, you would see that they are people in power of different races.
Sure.
None of the races are being discriminated as much as before. Before, maybe they are not being discriminated, but naturally those who live in the urban areas have more economic gains than those who live in the rural areas. So do you think the racial tension in today's era is getting larger, or it is being minimized?
It's a bit of a misrepresentation to refer to Forbes' richest 100 list and say that we've made it.
The recent one is the Forbes 10 most richest
10.
Malaysian billionaires.
But that's the thing. It's a little bit of a misrepresentation to look at that and use that as a gauge of where we've come from as a country. Because at the end of the day, those guys, I'm happy for them that they've made the Forbes richest list, but it doesn't get to people like you and I. I mean, you and I are not very rich either. But when you consider the fact that wealth distribution favors those who are able to take advantage and work the system, then we have a problem of disparity. Because at the end of the day, you want people who are earning, less than 3,000 ringgit a month to be able to have a share of that wealth. And not so much as to be on the Forbes list, but to be able to earn enough that they're able to send their kids to school, feed, pay for rent, or get a home, buy a car, etc. And right now, what's very clear is that you make 3,000 ringgit. Somehow or another, you're considered middle class, but honestly, it doesn't cut it anymore. It's not enough. So at the end of the day, and you qualify for BRIM as well. If you are middle class, how is it that you then need financial assistance? Mm-hmm. So what you then need to consider is not so much as to gauge who are the really rich in order to see how far you progress, but you need to see how many people who are still left behind, which is a better indication, I think, of where we are as a country. And you look at poverty, hardcore poverty in this country, you will find that it is at maybe around 3.4%, and in many respects, you look in the cities, the population of those who are poor, and not relatively poor, but poor, we're talking about, earning less than $2 a day, being of higher population in urban areas, because this is where instead of there being more poor in the rural areas, this is where the poor really are, in the cities of this country. In fact, get this, many of the homeless are actually homeless, not because they're unemployed, but because they make only enough to choose one of two options: feed yourself or pay for rent or pay for a place to stay. And many of them, of course, obviously, you have to have enough money to feed yourself, don't have a place to stay. So you find on the streets of Kuala Lumpur, for example, many who are homeless, but they actually have some form of employment. So that's the new reality for the country today, which is similar to what other countries elsewhere in the world are facing, you know, of much more developed countries.
In fact, it is what majority of the ASEAN countries are facing. There's this one article reported that inequality in Southeast Asia is growing, and is growing at a very rapid pace. Is it? I mean, if you look at the present time, where, you know, economy is definitely one of the main point that people are concerned, especially with the introduction of GST, and also with a lot of development that is going on, including the Greater KL, the MRT, and the link, the high-speed train between Kuala Lumpur and also Singapore. So, in your point of view, like, isn't this a good progress, a positive progress towards a better future for Malaysia?
I mean, let's face it. We like to point at infrastructure development as a form of evidence of progress for the country. But the reality is that at the end of the day, it really boils back down to individual households and individuals themselves on how they're able to live on a day-to-day basis, which really matters in terms of how you've progressed. That means you not only take into account economic progress on the individual's part, but also issues concerning civil liberties, human rights, etc. Also, ability to participate in political processes. So there's a few parameters in which we gauge progress. We cannot point to the Petronas Twin Towers, for example, and say we have progressed because we have built two phallic symbols in the middle of Kuala Lumpur. You can't, you know. And at the end of the day, that was built because, you know, a state-owned petroleum company was able to basically, you know, underwrite the construction of that. So it's not so much about the people. You know, of course, it's a source of aspiration. You go there and we see what we can do as a country. But really, we're talking about quality of education, quality of employment, unemployment levels.
So
stuff
what
like
you
that.
mean is the main area that the government need to really focus is human development, not so much on material development.
Yeah. You know, and the thing is that when you talk about human development, we have to consider things like literacy rate, for example. If you go on the literacy rate that you see that's formally published for the country, it's stated there that we have literacy rate of more than 90%. And then when you suddenly examine the rationale of how they get to 90%, you suddenly realize that the way they measure literacy in this country is through school attendance. Meaning, the assumption is if you attend school, you are present in school, you are able to go to school, therefore you must be literate.
It's not through a certain standardized
It's not.
assessment.
Yeah, and when you do it through the proper standardized assessment, you find that we actually drop from 90% to something that maybe around 70%. So what we're going to have to do as a nation, if we're talking about the next 50 years, and this is very important, because we need to stop kidding ourselves, is we need to be able to take stock in a realistic manner. Meaning, we must not be afraid to face up to the realities of today in order to address these problems, because only by addressing these problems today will we be able to look to the brighter future. But it's things like the literacy rate, for example, that drives me crazy, you know, because we have kids who are going up all the way up to Form 3, Form 5, and they can't read, they can't write, they don't know how to calculate, yet somehow, do mathematics, yet they've managed to go through the school system in such a way that it has not been able to catch them and to be able to provide them with some sort of education. So we need to address
And
these
another
things.
measurement is of course the rankings of university.
Yeah, of course.
And Malaysian university has never been ranked anything higher than
We've been
the
in
top
the top 200.
200. Yeah.
No, because at the end of the day, it's like business. You are going to be gauged based on real life measurements. Maybe in Malaysia, we can get away with it because we say if we don't like certain measurements, we'll say, oh no, we're different. We'll come up with our own instruments of measurement and we'll look and sound better when we apply these measurements because it's our measurement. We won't follow the international scale. But when we put ourselves against internationally accepted norms, we fall short. And we need to be able to realize that creating your own reality will be of no help if we are trying to progress to the future.
We will take a short break. When we return, we will talk about an article that was written about 6 days, 6 prime minister and 6 quotes.
ASEAN Breakfast Call Dialogue, widening your horizons.
Hi, we are back again. This is Arlene, and you are listening to Durian ASEAN, our ASEAN Breakfast Call. And with our ABC dialogue here, we have our guest Azrul Taib continuing his discussion on what's next for Malaysia in another 50 years. So, Azrul, earlier on I mentioned about this article which is written by Jahabar Sadiq.
Yeah.
He wrote about 6 days, 6 prime ministers, and 6 quotes. And what do you think of this?
Well,
the whole thing.
it's interesting because these are 6 prime ministers. Malaysia has 6 prime ministers, and these are very interesting 6 quotes that I think outline values which are very relevant to the future of Malaysia. The first quote was from Tunku Abdul Rahman, where he basically spoke about honesty. Second one was from Tun Razak, which he spoke about basically coexistence and living in harmony. Third Prime Minister, the quote here is about integrity. Dr. Mahathir is quoted here as talking about being hardworking and, making it happen because we work hard, we deserve to be rewarded for working hard. Abdullah Badawi speaking about religious harmony. And of course, the current Prime Minister, Najib Tun Razak, talking about change. So, if you look at the first quote here from Tunku
Not
Abdul
one
Rahman.
Malaysia?
No, not one Malaysia. Change.
That's very Obama-centric.
But we'll get inspired by change. But also, if we're talking about the next 50 years of the country, things need to change. So it's very relevant that the last quote here is about that.
Every prime minister in Malaysia, they always have a legacy that they want to be known. For example, Tunku Abdul Rahman, he wants to be known as someone who is the person that ruled Malaysia right after independence. And of course, Mahathir with his industrialization and a few others focusing on different aspects of development. What is your view on all these prime minister and their legacies?
Well, they're all interestingly father of something. A father of independence was Tunku Abdul Rahman. A father of modern Malaysia was basically, and development was basically Dr. Mahathir. Interestingly, there's no mothers there, right? They're all men thus far.
We haven't had any woman prime minister
Yeah, when
yet.
is that going to happen, right? No, but consider the fact that, each of these prime ministers talk about values that outline a certain aspiration for the country. Things that the country needs to, and the people especially, need to embody in order to progress as people, as a country, but also in order for us to be more than what we are today. And you find that when we're talking about things like honesty and integrity, in the context of corruption that happens, in today's Malaysia, where almost every aspect of what we do tends to have a certain percentage of corruption, then these quotes, these values come very much into relevance of that. The thing has always been that it's very nice to see all these quotes, but what do we do about it as a people? Do we even believe in embodying these values, or even trying to address some of these issues that have been concerned? So we need to look at these quotes and think whether these are problems that need to be addressed, values that need to be aspired to, and whether or not we ourselves believe in them. And I don't think we're there yet,
We meaning the government of the day or the society?
I think, we like to blame governments as being the responsible and the cause of problems, to be the bane of our existence. But at the end of the day, we deserve the government that we get. I mean, Malaysia is a democracy. We exercise a privilege of voting in the ballot box every 5 years or so, or less. And if we are going to pangkar, if we're going to do a cross or vote for an individual, then that person represents us. So if you vote in a crook, then you get a crooked government. If you vote for a good person, then you'll get, at least some hope for a better government. So we need to be able to be part of that process in order to see some of these values to be expressed in
But
our government.
isn't it a chicken and egg thing? A lot of the people, especially within the civil society, would claim that there's a lot of indoctrination happening towards our society. The best example is our education system. It is still not on par in terms of international standards, and there's a lot of indoctrination, especially in terms of our history, is going on. One thing I want to highlight about the legacies that being left, of course, there are positive aspect of the legacy, especially in terms of development, regardless whether it's material development or human development. But at the same time, do you think the government of Malaysia from independence until now have done justice to the Malaysian population?
Legacies are what the Prime Minister makes of it, but also how we allow those things to actually develop.
For example, the racial riot in 1969, it instead of making things better, instead we have more policy that limits freedom. For example, we have the Sedition Act, the revised, the amendments in the Sedition Act, which they added a few other articles, were being enacted post 1969, as well as another form of policy such as the economic policy that were formulated post 1969. So how can we progress forward?
Again, this is where we ourselves have to look back at what our role is in a democracy. We cannot play the helpless victim where we are at the mercy of other people in order where we pasrah, as they say in Indonesia, Malaysia, you just let go and it's somebody else, we can't do anything. We have to get rid of this mindset. In order for us to be able to get the kind of laws, legislation, politicians that we want, but also the kind of results that we expect from a much more developed governance of a democracy, then we have to be able to voice out. We have to be able to stand up and speak out on how we want things to be. You mentioned about the past where you used the word indoctrinated, and I have to say that it's true. In a way, Malaysian society has almost been, if you watch Star Trek, the word is Borg. We've been assimilated. We've been told you have to toe the line. You have to say certain things. You can only do certain things, and you can only be expected to conduct yourself in a certain manner. Those days are past. Today, as a result of better education, the reward for progress is a population that is able to think beyond what the government expects you to think. And that is the reward of progress, which is the bane of a lot of governments, because democracies are noisy. I mean, all we have to do is look at Indonesia and we see that it's a messy process. You know, everybody is demonstrating every other day. You know, people are stating their opinions
So
about
are you
everything.
saying we are moving towards the right direction?
Yeah.
As you remember, in early 2000, we have the Bersih
Yeah.
movements until now.
Yeah.
And the Bersih movement is the pinnacle of how Malaysian society has somehow risen up. Although I have to say, prior to Mahathir's era, especially in 1970s, there were a lot of protests made.
Well, I have to say it wouldn't be the pinnacle. I would say it's a very clear manifestation of how we have progressed as a country. Because in the past, you wouldn't even imagine hitting the streets to talk about clean and fair elections. You wouldn't see Makcik who sells goreng pisang back in Kuala Besut there in the streets of KL talking about a national issue. You wouldn't see it. But as a result of where we have progressed, we can be proud of ourselves. Not ashamed, but proud of ourselves to be able to say, I was there on the streets of KL that day to be talking about clean and fair elections because I care. And that's what we want. Because democracy doesn't involve subcontracting it to somebody else to do the job. It's about getting down and dirty, getting your voice to be heard in order for changes to be made. Decisions are made by those who show up. If you don't show up, somebody else is going to make the decision. You're not going to like the decisions, because some of those people are pretty nasty. So at the end of the day, what you look at is that if you want to see a better improvement, if you want to talk about legacy, and this is where legacy is important, because post-Mahathir, we had a much more freer sort of society. I think where we moved from the firm and guided hand of Dr. Mahathir, showing us this is how we should be, this is how it will be done, and basically I know what's best.
Not to the guided hands of Najib and Badawi.
Well, yeah, towards the much more relaxed, hands of Patlah and Najib, where there is a certain amount of trust here. Because you've got to be able to trust the people in order for them to be able to voice out what they need, what they want to see, what the future is for them. And you respond to that. That means instead of you determining what the future is going to be, which was the case in Dr. Mahathir's period, because he had vision, is that now you depend on what the input from the people is in order to guide you in how you want it to be, because the future is going to be in the hands, in a democratic society, of those who you represent. That's important.
I have to talk about Mahathir. As we all know, he has been part of our lives throughout the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s.
Grew up with him, man.
In fact, in any school activities, when you talk about who's your
favorite,
I still remember who's your role model. Almost everyone would say Mahathir. For some reason,
I said the same thing.
I do not know why. and because of that, Mahathir has very much. I mean, his words and his wisdom has very much been part of Malaysia, either for the better or for the worse. And one of his, I'm not sure whether to call this wisdom or not, but one of it is about the myth. Not the myth, but the book called The Malay Dilemma, where he somehow criticizes the Malay as being lazy. And he continued to say that it's not something new. He continued to say that in one question and answer that he said, I spent 22 years trying to change the Malays, trying to alter the perception that they were lazy. I feel it was spoken by him. And what do you think about this? Do you think he's right or wrong?
It's a matter of perception. It's relative perception as to whether he is right on the money about it or he's totally wrong. Because there have been a lot of successful Malays. There have been a lot of failures. So, Dr. Mahathir is one of those interesting individuals who, in order in his view, to get people going is to kick them in the butt. And that's what he's done. He's basically trying to light a
But he
fire.
said he has failed.
Yeah.
Should he blame the whole community
Well,
for being supposedly lazy?
You know, this is where...
Or is it just a myth?
No, I don't think it's a myth. I think there's some truth in it, that at the end of the day, in order for us to succeed, I think Dr. Mahathir put it very nicely in this quote from him, where he said, if you are not prepared to work hard for ourselves, then we deserve to be left behind. I mean, his way is tough love. Nasib lah, you know, if you don't want to move yourself, then nobody's going to do it for you and you're going to be left behind. That's it. So what he is trying to say here is that it's not necessarily literal that all Malays are lazy. I don't think that's what he intends to do. I think what he intends to do is, by putting this almost slur on somebody of his own ethnic community, he is telling them to get off your collective, you know, and work yourselves, you know, be successful. Or more importantly, for some people who really are very upset with Dr. Mahathir, prove me wrong. And I think that's what he's doing. He's tossing a challenge there. He's throwing the gauntlet on the floor and says, you people are a bunch of lazy, and, you know, prove me wrong. And to a certain extent, that's not a bad idea. I think we all need a little bit of tough love. And he's been known to do that. He's been doing it for 3 decades. And I don't think he's going to stop.
But is it also because we've been with him as the Prime Minister? There was a time where I can never imagine anyone else would replace Mahathir. And maybe because we have been under him for so long, once he's not there, then suddenly the floodgate is out. Like, people suddenly realize, hey, I can say whatever I want and I don't have Mahathir to be behind my back, kicking my, you know.
No, that's absolutely true. But this is where it goes back to my earlier point. In the past, in a way, we were pretty much taking it easy as well. It's like we didn't have to worry. Dr. M was there to think about the future, to guide the economy, to guide the country, and we will be in safe hands. You know, we've entrusted the future of the country to him. Suddenly when he's gone, resign, he wants to retire, you know, he also wants to ride his horse in Argentina and to go on vacations and everything. He wants to have a life too. Suddenly we're like left with, oh, wait a minute. Suddenly there's nobody else to articulate the vision. Where are we going to be in the future? So now it imparts upon us, because we are part of this democracy, we need to be able to have a hand in that. And that requires us to speak out. And that's important for all those politicians who are hearing this show right now, is that you cannot think of the voices of the constituency or the people as being a threat to you. It's actually a way for you to be able to be guided in how you want to be able to represent your people better.
So let's talk about the future, the next 50 years, which is quite some time later on. Do you think we still need to confine ourselves into this kind of system where we need to be told, like, this is the way it is, we need tough love, and we need to be reminded that, you know, how much we need to improve ourselves, or not we'll be left behind and deemed as lazy? Do we really need this for the next 50 years? Or shall we opt to a different sort of direction altogether?
Well, first and foremost, I think next 50 years, I expect us to be with flying cars. You know, I think hopefully we'll have less traffic congestion. But, you know, if we're talking about change in society in the next 50 years, all we have to do is look at countries that are older than us to realize that there are lessons to be learned, things we can avoid, and good examples to be had in order to avoid making the mistakes that they've made. All you have to do is look at countries like Europe. The countries in Europe, the United Kingdom, the US. Many of these countries have been around for more than 100 years. You know, in the case of the UK, it's been a lot more than 100 years. You know, and US is like more than 200 years, and so forth. And there is a certain measure of expectation of what we are able to do. And one of the things that is expected is that there will be more freedom of participation in those societies in order for them to be able to make the country a better place. You know, talking about increased civil society engagement, talking about participation in parliamentary processes. In fact, the crazy thing is this. We have democracies like in India and Pakistan who are, you know, just like maybe slightly older than us by a few decades or 10, 15 years or something. Yet they've already had female prime ministers. You know? Malaysia, we can't even begin to think.
We will be having one Aziza, I suppose, as the
For
first ever Menteri Besar.
Chief Minister, well, the jury's out on that one yet. We don't know what's going to happen over in Selangor. But you see, this is the kind of courage that we need to be, you know, it's crazy to think that we need courage just to appoint somebody to lead the country. It's not even based on who can do the job best. It's about what plumbing you have down there. You know, but this is the thing. If we're looking at the next 50 years, we need to be able to think about leading other countries, not following other countries. 50 years ago.
But do you think we have a clear two-party system as what the opposition would envision in 2008?
We're not there yet. Honestly, we're not there yet. I mean, at the end of the day, both the opposition and then also the ruling coalition needs to evolve. They need to grow up. Because if you go to parliament and you listen to what they're debating, you feel like, oh my God, I can't believe I voted this guy in, you know. Because we are not yet having enough expectations of a certain kind to our political representation. I think it's whoever can go in and talk, you know, BS sometimes, you know, whenever they do the political rally. We have to move away from that. Demand better.
Let's talk about the future. Let's talk about future young politicians that you really feel that they would make Malaysia more progressive than we are right now. Who are they?
Well, you know, the best thing about this whole process of change that's happening to the country is that we are starting to see the emergence of young leaders who are giving hope towards an alternative political environment that instead of the same old, all fossilized, literal as well as rhetorical, opinions, etc., but towards a much more energetic, much more substantive, you know. I give you, and they're happening on both sides of the divide. You look at Khairi Jamaluddin, for example. I know all the girls swoon, you know, whenever he's around.
He's very active on Twitter, by the way.
Yeah, I know. It's like got a whole fan club going on there, you know. But he is one of those people that you want to have because he's a thinking politician. And we need thinking politicians. We need people who are able to articulate their vision, but also to argue, you know. So it's not about calling people names, cow, or, you know, whatever dumb name, the calling that you have in the parliamentary sessions, but able to have the courage to debate in public, but also on air, on issues of national concern. And Khairi is one of those. We have, on the other side, we have, for example, Tony Phua, you know, who's been around for now, a decade now, who's been very smart. He's been one of those young intellectuals who is also not identifying himself necessarily as ethnic group, but also looking at a much more broader Malaysian perspective. Mujahid, for example.
That's from PAS.
From PAS, you know, who is not only inspirational, the fact that he comes from a political party that is supposed to be very conservative and yet speaks a national language and national narrative, but also one that is not polarized to one religion or one culture.
In fact, he's working together with Saifuddin
Abdullah
and also Anas Zubaidi to produce a book called New Politics.
Yeah. I mean, Saifuddin Abdullah is a great example of a great politician who is speaking the language of moderation, you know, who is from UMNO. And, you know, he speaks like a Malaysian who is looking beyond ethnic.
And all these leaders that you mentioned, they all have break away from this race-based
Yeah.
identification of politics and also economy.
Yeah.
Have they?
Yeah. We have to be honest here. There is some adherence to ethnic economics, ethnic politics, but there is less of that with these individuals, meaning they don't pander to the ethnic or religious politics in order to get support. They don't. They are actually practicing the new kind of politics in this country, which we will expect to replace the current divisive and ethnic polarizing politics that we have today, which we inherited from back in the 60s all the way up to today. They are practicing politics on the substantive issues of the day. So if we're talking about GST, then we're talking about GST regardless whether this affects which ethnicity or some other, If we're talking about things like terrorist threats, we're talking it strictly from a national security point of view, talking about issues of economy, talking about international relations. It's strictly from the basis of the country, and we need that kind of people.
So are you optimistic of Malaysia maybe not in the next 50 years, in the next general election?
So sooner.
There will be
It's
another
asking
5
a lot.
years.
I tell you, I like to talk about the Gen Y group, which had a lot of hopes and aspirations from the previous general elections, and then everybody was expecting change to happen, which was basically change of government. And I was thinking, no, of course it won't happen. It won't happen so quickly.
A lot of people were disappointed. You can see
Yeah.
it from the 505 rally
Of
at
course.
Klanajaya Stadium.
No, but hell, this is how you build a country. It's not a one-off project that you just got yourself involved in 3 months and expect because of your participation you will have change. Unfortunately, despite the fact that we expect instant gratification for the efforts that we do, it doesn't work that way. Nation building involves investment of decades, if not generations of time. So at the end of the day, if we are looking towards a much more vibrant democracy like we expect in the UK or the US, where you can freely expect that the government would change conservative to Labour, from Republican to Democrat, and Malaysia, I don't know, maybe one day Barisan Nasional will no longer be in power, and whatever takes over from that, maybe Pakatan Rakyat or some other, will, maybe that could happen in 2 election cycles rather than 1. If we see it in 1, then it's a good thing. The sooner this happens, the better for all of us, because it is where we need to be able to expect change through this process. We cannot not have it. We have to have a situation where we must break this monopoly of government, of governance. Malaysia has, in the world, is currently the country with the longest running coalition government, in the world. And it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing, because democracies involve, changing hands of power. Because if you only have one, then it becomes a situation where you're not accountable. You feel that you can do no wrong, and you don't have to work for it as hard. So we have to know that.
So Malaysia is the longest. The second longest would be Singapore, I bet.
I don't know. It could be Singapore. Yeah, it could be Singapore, PAP and all that. Yeah. So we don't want to hold that record. Seriously. Maybe the biggest Hapam Balik we can hold the record, but certainly not for that one. I wouldn't.
So before we end this, what's your wish for in conjunction with Malaysia Day?
My biggest wish that I would like to share with those listeners out there, but also in things especially for Malaysia Day, is that we need, in order to have change happen, we must not expect it from others, but we must be part of that change. We must participate, because decisions are made by those who show up. And if we expect somebody else to do it for us, then the decisions that will be made will be not necessarily in our best interest, but also could be against the interests of the country, but also ourselves. And we need to be able to stop being the silent majority. We need to be able to become the majority that participates and speaks out. We need to stand up, speak out, and participate in the process. Don't let somebody else decide for you. If you want a better Malaysia, then you've got to be part of that better Malaysia. That's my wish.
With that, thank you very much. Thank you, Azrul.
Thank you, Arlene, for having me on the show.